Welcome to the Five Phenomenon Podcast. I am your host, Shane Hayes, and coming up on this episode, writer Tom Shone. He's film critic for the Sunday Times, but he's just written a new book on Christopher Nolan, the Nolan Variations. It's, as far as I can tell, this is the first book with Christopher Nolan's actual participation. It's an interesting mix of biography, filmic analysis, interview book, and essay. It's a great read, and it's great to have him on the show. But first up, what I watched this week, if you guys listened to last week's episode and witnessed frequent co-host Ted Haycraft scoffing at me having Bill and Ted high on my top 10 list. So first off, I should mention that I have since amended my top 10 list, as is going to happen going into the new year. We mentioned on the episode, it's going to, being in a small market, it's going to last till February. We're going to keep changing as we see more stuff. There's actually this year still screeners we haven't seen. Somehow 2020 is still weirdly a normal year. But since recording last week's episode, there was one movie I'd seen at the time that I just forgot about. Never, rarely, sometimes, always. Which it was one of those Sundance movies that hits everybody's radar in January, and come the end of the year still is worthwhile, which in 2020 is a nice surprise, because since Sundance felt like the only normal film part of the year. But I did make sure to watch one of the two movies Ted mentioned besides I'm Thinking of Ending Things, that he thought was the only worthwhile movies this year, the significant ones for him, memorable ones. Brandon Cronenberg's Possessor. Now, I haven't seen Brandon Cronenberg's first movie, Antiviral, but I gotta give this one to Ted. He called it. This was deeply interesting movie. There's a little bit of his father in there. I disagreed with Ted that it's very much his father, but on a basic level, this movie has this great casting coup of Christopher Abbott and Andrew Riseborough, like two of just some of our best actors, both in one movie. And there's just a lot of interesting stuff going on in the movie. I won't lie and pretend that I was totally with it, but. And then added to that, The Assistant, Kitty Green's movie that is excessively vignette-y, which I found interesting. I did have that vibe that if a guy had directed this, people would have been calling it more visionary. But there's also, just on a personal level, anyone who's worked in the film industry, there was a lot of PTSD in the movie, especially towards the end. There's a sequence where she misunderstands from her boss whether or not she can go home, and it was the most intense sequence I saw all this year. But I'll try to keep this intro short since we have a great interview with Tom Shone coming up. One other irony I wanted to point out, that there's also a deep dive into just a lot of my overall views on Nolan's movies, my love of them, but at a certain point I start to get into the level of clarity of his dialogue and his audio clips, which anyone who's listened to any of these episodes of the podcast will know. Don't throw rocks if you have glass houses. So enjoy the show and its audio quality. You're in Brooklyn, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Oh, so what is your background? What places have you lived in? Have you moved around to?
Yeah, I was in sort of London. I started reviewing movies in the 90s for the Sunday Times in London, the newspaper.
Okay.
And I came out to New York in 99. And so I've been in America since 99. But I'm still writing for the Sunday Times back home, if you know what I mean. So
yeah, okay.
So my journalistic career is in London. Being out here, it means I can get access to people and interview people, and that's how most of the books I've written have come about. Anyway,
I asked because I for some reason I assumed there was an LA period, just because your first meeting with Christopher Nolan was at Cantor's in LA.
Oh yeah, that was just a sort of journalistic assignment. Like when I first came out here, it was for a magazine called Talk Magazine, and
Okay.
they had lots of money because they had Harvey Weinstein bankrolling it, and and so they were spending his money like Billio, and they would send us everywhere. It was like the last days of like journalistic sort of splendor, like it was the last great magazine opening, and of course it folded, and then that was the end of that era. And but for a while they were sort of sending us everywhere on, I mean, I remember they had like kind of, we would go out to LA for like a part. They had a party. I mean, now I'm as it's writing is a. I mean, it's gone through the, it's been hammered, but and journalism in particular has been hammered. But right, I look back on that time, and it's just like, God, they were like they were sending us to. We would get on planes to go to parties. It
Yeah.
was kind of crazy.
I mean, I hear about it from you guys' vantage points. It's completely wholly unfamiliar to me, or it just seems distant to all these internet journalists working right now. So, what was the genesis for starting the book? Was it just you had interviewed him a few times over the year, and you had the relationship with Christopher Nolan through that?
Yeah, I sort of met him in 2000, just on the eve of Memento coming out. Um,
Okay.
I know that was the interview I did for Talk magazine, and then I mean that was really it. I mean, our friendship or association or whatever you want to call it has really kind of it really took place professionally. Like it was, I would meet him. I met him again to write something about Interstellar, and then again for when Dunkirk came out. And each time I would kind of petition him to collaborate on a book, and he would generally say no and plead off and say I haven't made enough movies yet.
Oh,
And then
okay.
and then finally he had made enough movies. Like, I think Dunkirk was kind of it. I think it wasn't. Was it 10 movies? I think it was. That was his 10th. And so for some reason that just felt like, he'd done this kind of big Second World War movie. He'd reached a certain point in his career, and maybe felt like it was time for a retrospective. So that's, I think, why he agreed to do it. Um, but yeah, so knew him professionally, really.
Okay. Well, I mean, when we exchanged emails earlier, I was telling you how like it felt like right that someone needs to write a good book on him right now, and you were feeling a great market need. But I was thinking about it also, like I see his point that he's like you talk a lot in the book about his streak, like he's had that commercial critical streak that hasn't been broken. You compare it to like David Lean and Hitchcock, and it's almost like a lot of these books have to be written to have an arc to them where there is a fall or a return, and Nolan hasn't technically really had that yet. Really, I mean, unless I mean we're going to talk about Tenet for in depth, I think, in this episode of down the line because it seems to have come up multiple times on this show. But the book, you found a narrative arc into it. Like it just the digressions alone were just so entertaining in the book, and you got really into his influences, and you managed to make a narrative out of his influences, how they kept, and his development as an artist too. It was. Are you familiar with the books of Jeff Dyer?
Yes. Yeah.
It reminded me. It felt like a Jeff Dyer book with an interview into
Oh,
it.
thank you. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of, I was. That's nice of you to say. I mean, the it really came because it was an attempt to solve the problem that he didn't want a biography, so the book
Mm.
wasn't going to have a biographical subject. By it was a it was
But you did sneak a lot of biography
yeah, there
in.
was
Yeah.
going to be a biographical chapter, but throughout I wasn't going to get that third person narrative where it was a fraught Nolan who saw in the new year on 2011. You know what I mean? Like that,
Mm.
he isn't going to appear as he didn't want to be objectified as a kind of character, in the way that biographies do. So I had to sort of find another way to kind of get into the films, but also give the reader a sense of proximity to him. And so his influences struck me as being the thing that I was certainly struck by, like how varied they were. From the first moment I met him, I sort of thought, God, it's so strange. This guy is sort of into, Borges, the Argentinian poet. That's not a name you would find in Hollywood.
That surprised me a lot too, but it
Yeah.
made sense after the fact.
And so that immediately interested me, that his interests were so out of the way. They weren't usual. And also I kind of came to realize that they actually were quite personal, and that if I pursued those, especially the bigger ones like kind of Borges and Chandler, they actually kind of brought me closer to him. So even though Nolan wasn't going to be in the book and I wasn't going to be psychoanalyzing him, nonetheless, if you kind of look into any of those other influences, especially the bigger ones, is that there's always some kind of chord it strikes with his own story, his own upbringing, and his own biography. I mean, in Borges's case, it was the fact that he was moved around so much. In Chandler's case, it was the fact that he went to this a similar type of school. I mean, so
The
in a
American
way,
England part too.
yeah, and that kind of gave me the confidence to sort of go, well, if I go down the rabbit hole with some of these, more digressive elements with the secondary cast of characters, that I would be rejoining with him at some point. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
that sort of, but it definitely took a while for me to realize that, and it took me a while to figure out what it was going to, how it was going to read. Because he didn't want a biography, and I didn't want a book of interviews per se. Q&A.
Yeah, no, I get that. It was funny because I watched Interstellar yesterday, and I remember thinking that the book was an extension of Murph's library shelf,
Yeah.
which the book seemed to be a lot of his influence. I remember immediately after, or a few weeks after seeing Interstellar for the first time, that was when I finally made the full commitment to dive into the LA Quartet because I recognized the big nowhere on the shelf at the key scene.
Mm.
But I mean, you also, I mean, you do try to resist the psychoanalysis, but you illuminate his childhood in a way I don't think anyone's illuminated before or really talked in depth about.
Yeah, I mean, that was, it was always going to have a kind of brief biographical chapter at the beginning. And, he wasn't that keen on it, but I, persuaded him that the book needed it. And, I found it pretty interesting. I mean, I found generally that there were more connections there between particularly his kind of adolescence and the movies that he makes.
Yeah.
And he sort of resisted it. He's not that keen on that angle. And it was mostly, so really what appears in that chapter is just sort of, our kind of compromise where, the amount of detail that he could live with, and me sort of being, respectful in the connections that I made and sort of not kind of going completely overboard. I mean, it was possible for me to have written a much more kind of psychoanalytic book. But I found that it didn't, as much as I was keen on that, because he was not that, because he wasn't, unless I was going to turn that conflict into the sort of the main event of the book, it wasn't going to get me very far. And that the more I kind of went down that road, the less it seemed to belong in this book. So it was weird. I actually felt like in the end I was doing, like, I sort of think that, if a biographer was to come along, they would be able to kind of use the book as a kind of roadmap, like it's all there. But I wasn't going to be the one that sort of spelt out this or that connection.
Well, I mean, I think it ended up being the best of both worlds because there was just, like a lot of the psychoanalysis is going to end up being kind of, especially if you're limited to certain interviews, like it's going to feel a little dime store after a certain point. And but at the same time, if you actually illuminate instances of his life, and my favorite one was the way you compared the place where all the heist members from Inception slept to his dorm, or the dorm he had at school, at boarding school or whatever, not boarding school, but that was one. And you had the pictures, like
Yeah,
that was a
yeah.
really neat
I mean,
one.
I must admit, like when I saw that picture of the dorm, I thought, God, that seems familiar to me. Like I've seen
Yeah,
that. And it's not because I've slept in a dorm, and it's not because I've been to boarding school. It's just because I've seen enough of his movies in which that repeated form with converging lines towards the horizon line, parallel lines, low ceiling, like I've seen that many, many times in his films, not just in Inception actually, but like, the Wayne boardroom in, the Batman movies. And There's similar kind of compositions in most of them, but yeah, Inception in particular, I think, because it had its sort of inception at his boarding school. He sort of dreamt the plot up while he was there, um, and so yeah, I sort of think like, I mean that I sort of pressed him on that as to sort of why that architecture would be so, why he would return to it, and it's there in Interstellar a little bit as well. And he didn't, he didn't really know. I mean, it's sort of, it's, but I did, certainly I've read other accounts of other borders, and, I mean, essentially it was his home for like, 5-7 years. So yeah, of course it's going to figure in the kind of some of the sort of architecture and structures you make movies about. I mean, it's weird. I had a similar, while I was sort of looking into that, I had a similar breakthrough with realizing that Kubrick did much the same thing, because I was struck by how similar that composition is to a lot of Kubrick shots. Kubrick too loves that very kind of
center vanishing points,
symmetrical composition, repeated forms disappearing into the distance.
Yeah.
And and I, there was when he was a teenager, the house they lived in the Bronx was on a stretch of street that was modelled on the Champs Elysees in Paris, which is going to get very kind of. It was very architecturally kind of grand.
Okay.
And when you kind of prowl the corridors of that apartment block that the Kubricks lived in, it's a little bit like kind of going down the corridors of one of the hotels that appear in his work. You kind of feel like you want to do it with a kind of Steadicam shot, and you think, well,
yeah,
that's kind of where Kubrick discovered his love of photography, and so it makes sense.
You always think of Kubrick as the father or the current model of wide-angle lens too, and those are always going to get enough of a background into where you want to design your compositions to go toward, show, like you said, have the vanishing point or have the parallel lines going in. The other thing I was thinking about with the book is, maybe it was just the biographical details, but I was thinking that Nolan hasn't given a lot of information about himself, which is funny for a filmmaker who has 3 or 4 movies where there's strong interpretations where the lead character is dressed like him exactly and looks very similar to him. You have 2 movies where a main character is named Cobb in it.
Mm-hmm.
I had this feeling that he hasn't given that many interviews, but at the same time, I mean, you've been doing a ton of interviews or these like Zooms for the book release with him, usually in conjunction, right? Like he does do a lot of interviews. He does give a lot of information. As an interview subject, did you have to do a lot of digging to get, or was he close to the vest on stuff, or was he giving you similar answers, or did you feel like you got a lot of good information on, or did you have to keep pushing at it?
Well, yeah, I mean, he joked when I first met him again to talk about the book that he was the most visible reclusive director in America. So that's his way of.
That's a great description,
right? He gives a lot of interviews, but he's also kind of perfected that self-cloaking sort of trick that a lot of Englishmen have of kind of talking without giving away much about themselves. And so
I was going to ask if it was a British thing.
Yeah, I think a little bit. I mean, he so I mean, I was sort of sensitive to that. I mean, I sort of understood. I didn't kind of go in pressing. I didn't, but the thing is, he over time did give me a lot of his time, and we kind of acclimatized to one another. And a lot of it for me was just returning to things that I found interesting, and him agreeing to kind of go back, and so I think of the book as being kind of layered up. Of all these sort of different sort of interviews. So one topic I might return to several times, and that was really how it kind of. I guess that's kind of where I got the greatest sense of advance, anyway, on the kind of pre-existing information. I mean, that and just as I say, just using the films as a roadmap, really, and sort of thinking, well, what are the films about?
Yeah. Okay. Well, how long were the sessions? And I mean, you were going out to LA on most of these, or were
Yeah,
many of these phone call session marathons, or?
yeah. I mean, I would go. They were sort of basically they would be long mornings, like 3 hours from 9 till sort of lunchtime, and I went out there and rented a kind of small memento-ish apartment, sort of in the locality, and so we got into a sort of routine, and so we'd do maybe 3 days of a week over a kind of 2 week period, and then I would go away, and then I would come back again. But there, I would say, yeah, I mean, we definitely sort of put in a fair number of hours, and I really had to just be prepared for let the conversation go where it wanted to go. I mean, he's got a very kind of, unsurprisingly, a kind of mazy head and a sort of labyrinthine approach to things. Subjects connect up with other subjects, and sort of the thing I learned to do is just to kind of go with the flow a little bit and not try and direct the conversation too much, but just sort of literally just go, down whichever sort of rabbit hole appeared to be nearest. And and in the end, that kind of gave me a little bit of the structure of the book too. Like, I just had to kind of learn to kind of allow the book to be a bit mazy, too, and not to kind of worry too much about where it was going to end up. But yeah, I mean, he's very punctual. We met at 9 every morning.
I think that I remember that detail in the book. Yeah.
Which I always thought was very interesting. Like, he's very observant of time. People associate, I think, because he plays with time so much. Um, you don't quite know what that's going to be in human terms. Like, what's that person like? Well, actually, that person is exceedingly punctual. Like, in other words, he doesn't play around with time. He is very observant of time, and the amount of time he gets to shoot a movie is also a kind of great discipline that he's kind of learned to abide by. So when it runs out, he runs it. He doesn't plead for extra time or reshoots or director's edition, or it's sort of the end of the movie is the end of the movie.
That definitely surprised me. You said that either I don't know if you meant objectively that he was a fast shooter or that he prides himself on being a fast shooter, or at the very least always under schedule. But it fits. I mean, even if these are 150 $200 million movies, like he seems like he's a fiend for pre-production too. Like his pre-productions have to be massively epic, and they're not ready to shoot until every detail is figured out in pre-production.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how it compares to other. I mean, certainly in comparison to other directors in that kind of franchise world, I think his pre-production is kind of feels quite luxurious. When you think about the amount of pre-production that someone will get if they're doing a superhero movie, it's not that long. I don't know what the sort of figure is, but yeah, I mean, the pre-production, the areas where I sort of focused the most in the book were on the pre-production and then the post-production, because essentially the rule of the book was I was only get to talk to him. I wasn't going to talk to his collaborators or anybody else. So it wasn't going to be one of those kind of gossip on the film set kind of books. So,
Okay.
so what does that give me? Okay, well, that gives me essentially all his prep, and then it gives me all of his, editing and music after he's shot it. So although there's some account of production in it, it's pretty skimpy compared to most film books, where pre-production is almost the only thing you're seeing.
That it's a big point of pride I make on this show is specific being an editor. Like I shortchange pre-production a lot. I give you that, but I hate the way the entertainment press only fixates on production and what the stories the actors have in production. So I appreciate that. The Lee Smith asides in the book, I appreciate it though, as well too. And the Hans Zimmer, him and Hans Zimmer's relationship, I find endlessly fascinating, and I felt like you illuminated a lot on that too.
Yeah, I mean, that was the one that I wasn't expecting. I didn't. There were certain surprises in the book and one of them was the importance of music. I didn't know going into it that was going to be such an important thing. It gives the book its sort of title, and but yeah, and
Mm.
it was. But I realized, perhaps belatedly, that he just has this very unusual method of working with his composers, mostly with Hans Zimmer, evolved with Hans Zimmer, But I think he started it with David Julien as well, which is he involves them in pre-production. So he doesn't come to them with a finished movie and says, write a score to fit the cuts I've made here.
Right.
He asked them to score the film frequently. I mean, my euphemism for it was blind. I mean, he's asking them to score the film blind. They don't get to see it, and they don't get to sort of, but they are given the script, or they're given some ideas about a character, as in the case of the Joker, and they're told to go away and experiment for sort of, 6 months or whatever it was that Zimmer did. And then they come out of it with, Zimmer will come back with a kind of a sort of an array of options, not a finished score, but an array of options. And and then Nolan and he will go through them, and Nolan will pick out this, and the other. So he's kind of almost a co-composer. I mean, he's sort of he's having the Joker's theme was selected by him. It was composed by Zimmer, but it was selected from all these many options by Nolan. So he's making kind of creative choices. So he's very much involved in the kind of creative process of the music behind the films in a way that I hadn't really sort of seen that with other filmmakers. I mean, Spielberg has a very close relationship with John Williams, but there's no sense that he's kind of, in on John Williams's sort of creative task.
Yeah, and I think Williams still scores the picture pretty efficiently
Yeah,
too.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Um, and so, the way I sort of saw the relationship is that, with each movie they made, um, they kind of got closer and more kind of symbiotically kind of related to one another until they get to the point of Dunkirk, and they're really there in that picture. It's very hard sometimes to say what's in the sound design and what's in the score. They're very kind of integrated in the image, so at that point they take a break. I think they've brought that union to a kind of a high point. They've the apotheosis of that relationship is Dunkirk.
Yeah, well, that's the one where they're like the watch recordings, like how I mean if you have a good music editor, it's typically like much more. It helps to be more integral of a score, especially if you're going to have a bold score, which Nolan's movies, the scores are as much as the engine as the narrative or the plot itself.
Mm.
And but to be that bold and not be that manipulative, you have to find a different way to like and be cinematic and move it around. You need to like. It's tricky to have a composer give you that many like sketches and color just because they tend to want to perfect something and they don't want to be taken advantage of work wise, and him and Zimmer seem to have like a good relationship, not to mention just how organic it ends up in the final movie, much less it's just always so fascinating how he talks about these ideas of like the ticking clock, and they make their way in, and I mean I'm sure they intuitively felt that way through the process, but it feels like they came up with this idea on day one, and it just so brilliantly came into the movie.
Yeah, I think on the Dunkirk one, I mean, although the score and the picture are very integrated, I gather that the process was pretty painful. I mean, of all of them, I think that was the most painful for Zimmer. I think there was a lot of
Mm.
cursing, as they tried to get the two to kind of, to marry. Because I think that Zimmer at first did go away and composed a sort of symphonic score for the film. I think, Nolan said, I want you to think of it as, I think I want to use real sounds. So think of a siren, and we want a score that kind of somehow revolves around a siren, And as I gather, kind of Zimmer didn't take to this suggestion immediately, and in fact went off and wrote a more traditional symphonic score in London, and then he came back with it, and they tried to kind of marry it to the film, and it just didn't. They just didn't work. They didn't meld. So he had to sort of start not from scratch, but he had to kind of jettison that approach, and then come back to the original idea of like incorporating actual sounds as Nolan had suggested. And I gather that was towards the end anyway, a kind of fraught process. I think they've been quite
You mentioned that a little in the book, yeah.
yeah.
I mean, The John Cage elements of it has always come across. Was you also mentioned this detail in the book of was it the Oscars for Dunkirk? Whenever the sound crew won, they made sure to was it the music editor they made sure to get into there?
They included in the, that's correct, yeah. As part of their kind of win for sound, they included one of the music editors who'd been helpful, kind of marrying the two. I mean, it's not, it's on several levels. I mean, the there are sort of sound effects in that movie which are kind of rhythmic, and they're used almost as sort of musical elements, like whether it be a sort of siren or the scraping of a boat, or
Yeah.
they're sort of using those sounds in a sort of rhythmic fashion, and it's almost part of the score. And then the other thing that's going on is these kind of great Shepard Tone organizational feats, with
I'm glad you brought up the Shepard Tone. The Shepard Tone is one thing that I first learned about through him, through a video of either, I don't know if Nolan was explaining how he used it or if someone else was explaining how he used it. But I was still working at a movie theater when Dark Knight came out. And one of the reasons I liked working at a movie theater well into my 20s was whenever there was a crossover movie, a movie that was a good movie that got people into the seats, usually there was typically one big moment that I'd always walk into and want to be witness the audience because you would feel the room. And like, I mean, the most obvious one I could think of would be like when Gandalf dies in Fellowship of the Ring. Spoiler alert for the 20-year-old movie. But another big one that always consistently got a whoop and a clap was in Dark Knight when the truck flipped. And I remember after the fact, once I found out about the Shepherd's Tone and the Shepherd's Tone being the sound behind the bat pod, there's a strong editorial idea of rhythm and release where the Shepherd's Tone keeps building in the bat pod and then it cuts off right like a beat before the truck flips.
oh, it does.
And and you just every time without fail when you witness an audience, it gets them every time. And this is you could talk in theory about why certain ideas might or might not work, especially when you're in the filmmaking process and really it's just like two guys in a or two filmmakers in a room with duvetine on the wall, lightless wall, windows. But seeing it in practice and it actually works and it works consistently with a room full of like 20, 300, 600 people. It like everything no one says about the theatrical experience works there, and it's like objectively proven. It's so cool. It's
Yeah.
so cool.
So if I'm right, you're saying that it just cuts out. So what you have is actually silence before the crash of the. Is that
There's
correct?
a beat. No, it's a very rhythmic silence. It goes. He missed, and then it cuts off, and then there's a strong sound effect of the truck moving, and it busies the ear a little, just enough to where you can see what it's going on. It's going along with the hugeness of the effect. And then there's the huge sound, and where the clap always happened is the shot after where the bat pod does its little flip, and you could maybe argue that the flip is the bow that gets everyone to clap. But I mean the one principle in editing I talk about over and over is whenever something doesn't work, it's not the moment that doesn't work, it's the buildup, it's the thing 20 minutes earlier. And the opposite is true here, where like when an effect works, you got to give credit to the buildup to it. And the Shepherd's Tone on the bat pod buildup, it just creates this tension, and it's a rhythm and release. You got the rhythm of the Shepherd's Tone going up and up and up, and it feels like it just keeps going. And then when it stops, there's the release of the truck flip. It worked every time.
Yeah, I mean that whole sequence, from the beginning of the sort of hijack of the SWAT van through to that, I think,
You point out the music list, how the music cutting out.
yeah, I mean that to me was the sort of that was the sequence I watched where I sort of thought, that he had really he'd kind of submitted to he'd almost swallowed the Hollywood machine. Like,
Yeah.
instead of being a kind of a good little machinist, turning out his little bit of it, he had somehow, in the way the confidence of that sequence and the way that he uses silence and takes music out, and then and actually strips everything down. It seems that everything gets smaller as you go from like the the Batmobile to the Bat Pod, it sheds weight. It feels like it's sort of escaping, blockbuster overkill. It's actually kind of getting leaner, and it's being more stripped down. Like that's the sequence where I kind of feel like there's a great mixture of like maximalist effects and minimalist effects going on at the same time. Um,
Yeah.
and so it really just feels like Nolan has sort of mastered the Hollywood way of making movies, and he's kind of swallowed it. He's like the kind of, it always makes me think of like those images of like the anaconda that sort of swallowed the cow, and the
Mm.
anaconda is just digesting this huge thing. Like that, for some reason, that image always comes to mind with that. I mean, that's the film, that's the sequence anyway, that certainly made me, sit up and realize that like, he was finding some element of himself in a way that so many filmmakers don't when they go to Hollywood and make those big movies. They just kind of get swallowed up. And I sort of thought, oh no, it's something in him is getting expressed and released with this kind of sense of the size and the scope of the film, which is unusual.
You mentioned I like the way you described it, the mix of minimalism and maximalism. But there is that. I remember when Dark Knight came out, there was that feeling that a major filmmaker had taken the big leap forward. It was like, I don't know. I always come back to Kubrick with Nolan, so it felt like, I mean, Spartacus and Lolita are great movies, and Spartacus is obviously a big movie. But the Doctor Strangelove 2001, that was the era where he went another level. And Dark Knight, I mean, the other description I liked, I don't know if it was his or yours, but you described the story in Dark Knight as an engine. I don't know if it's a machine or an engine. And there's an efficiency in it, and like it works on everything, and it's so compressed, and it gets across so much, but it just keeps moving forward and forward.
Yeah, that's him. I think. Yeah, he described it. He he has a slight. I detected a slight resentment on his part towards the way everybody has advanced arguments, just like the one we've been advancing. Like the people that came along and said, no, The Dark Knight was the movie where like you've really nailed it and turned into the filmmaker that we love. I mean, and I understand it in a way. Like, what filmmaker isn't going to get,
Sure.
his nose put out of joint by that? Well, what was the matter with the first film? Like, so he has this sort of defensive stance towards the first film and wanting to sort of, big that up. By
Well, when you go
comparison,
back, you do see like, oh, it's good. It's just everything's clicky
yeah,
to
that's
another
right.
level.
But so that description of it, when he's talking about the Dark Knight, he was talking about it in very, I thought, just unvarnished terms. He says, when people talk about my movies being cold, that's the one I understand it, because that movie is a cold movie. When we watched it, we just said it's a machine, like, and it's kind of interesting. Like if
That's the quote.
that kind of candor is the Bennett, is what we get, because it's the underside of his resentment. Like he's willing to kind of just talk about it in such sort of bold terms because he's trying to undercut slightly some of the reverence around it, and I like that. I love that answer.
It's kind of like when Lucas, after he did Star Wars, and he was upset with all the money he put into ILM, said like, "Oh, the shots were only 85, or was it?" He had this low percentage, like the shots were only 50% of what I wanted them to be,
Yeah,
and then in Empire they were closer.
I mean, yeah, which sort of, and that all that makes me think is like, thank God, he only got 50% of what he wanted. Like, I prefer a filmmaker to work within the box, and like Nolan is such a good example of that because he's the thing that he really keeps would reiterate to me was that he really likes working within a set of constrictions, and he likes the discipline of having to persuade the studio, to kind of part with the money, the budget to make the film. He sort of likes the fact that there are limits on his sort of power, and that he has to, still persuade people. And I kind of I thought was interesting to me. I sort of, I think particularly after The Dark Knight, actually, because that was the movie where he pretty much could have done whatever he wanted after it. and you sort of sense that that probably was quite a dangerous time for him as a filmmaker, or it would have been for a lot of filmmakers anyway. They make a great big hit. They make $1 billion. The studios say you can do whatever you like next, and traditionally that the next film would be the one where they fall on their face. And the fact that he didn't, the fact that he comes back with the film I actually regard as the one I'm fondest of, Inception. I mean, to me, that really was quite extraordinary. And that shows enormous discipline. And and it shows him not like making life difficult for himself, but trying to kind of keep a set of constrictions around, like still being disciplined enough to go through kind of rewrites on that script with DiCaprio until it was kind of exactly right. And
Yeah, I mean, and it shows. I mean, I think of it less on the commercial side, but on the critical side, like the way Pauline Kael described 1900 with Bertolucci, where it was just like they have to make the bigger movies, and like, or we had an episode recently about Eyes Wide Shut, and I rewatched the Kubrick video where he talked about the myth of Icarus, and there's this feeling directors keep wanting to get bigger and bigger, and to a certain extent, Nolan has really straddled that line well, where he in theory sometimes, like, Dark Knight, he makes a point of saying it, like, we didn't have to make it bigger, but Dark Knight Rises has to be bigger. But for the most part, each movie has to find a new way of topping itself, and like he said, like, he still, like, the best way to get that done is proof of concept, like, to like convince other people like this is something that's worth
yeah,
doing, convince the executives this isn't worth putting the money into.
I mean, that said, I'm not sure they understood, a lot of the sort of, I think when you talk to, I mean, I didn't talk to them for this book, but I have done for previous articles. And when you talk to some of the executives who did greenlight Inception, it isn't necessarily that they understood it necessarily, but they just say, like, he went to sort of such enormous lengths to make sure that he was being completely inexplicable and understandable. But I think they just were kind of like waving him through more than he thought,
Fair enough.
but yeah, like I think it's weird. I mean, he's an epic filmmaker, but he's at the same time this kind of very claustrophobic one. I mean, the only way I kind of could really think about it, the only way that made sense for me was just to sort of link all these opposites. So, you know, his characters are often finding freedom in constriction. So it's when they're in jail that they're actually at their most dangerous. His villains are at their most dangerous when they're in jail normally.
I remember you had that part in the book. I remember finding it an interesting observation because I remember after Dark Knight did it, then you had all like multiple big IP blockbusters doing the exact same thing. You had Avengers and Skyfall all do the exact same thing and put their villain get captured in the middle of the second act.
Right. And then conversely, the opposite of that is you have a number of characters, and often the heroes, who find themselves sort of lost in space. I mean, quite literally lost in space in the sense of Interstellar, but sort of vast space tends to sort of imprison his characters, and constriction seems to set them free. So it's a series of paradoxes that I think have it's him. I mean, they're linked in his sort of worldview or psyche. But the point is, it gives him a great advantage when it comes to handling the kind of epic scope of each film being bigger than, because I think there's something in him that just undercuts. If you give him a vast canvas, he'll just try and flip it. And I think that has helped him enormously. And so I think Dunkirk is a really good example of that, where in some ways it's like the smallest movie he's done in sort of a long time. I mean, it feels big because of the way he shoots it, but if you take away, I mean, most of the action takes place on a sort of single sort of couple of miles on a beach, and it gets even tighter as it kind of goes on. And the script is incredibly short, and like
that. I remember being his first movie under 2 hours in years. That was pretty notable.
And again, you would have expected at that point maybe him to get kind of bloated. For the filmmaking to get bloated. But instead he kind of gives us this kind of very lean sort of Second World War movie, which is a very unusual thing.
I'm gonna get this wrong. Truffaut had this thing. I want to say it was three things, but two of them were cinema. Good cinema has to have intimacy and spectacle. Does that sound familiar?
Sounds good. Yeah, is that a true fact? I've had versions of that. I didn't know.
I think there's a third one, and I'm forgetting it too.
I mean,
A gun, a gangster. I don't know.
yeah, it's like an intimate epic. Like that's
Yeah.
the phrase that kind of springs to mind. Yeah, so I don't know kind of where that comes from, but it certainly meant that he has been able to sort of string together, this extraordinary run of films. And I have to say, I'm a very what's the word? I'm a nervous Nolan fan in the sense that with each film, I'm convinced he's going to fall flat on his face, and it kind of adds something to the thrill when he does, when he doesn't. But yeah, like I definitely each time I'm like, but I can remember before Inception going, this has, this film is not
Yeah.
going to work. I just know, I feel it.
Yeah, I remember that feeling like this is going to be the movie that changes cinema.
Yeah, that's right. And then to actually have it work on that set of themes too, which have led so many people astray. Again, I was just very impressed by that.
Let's use this to turn to Tenet then. Have you, what's been your approximation of the critical reception to it, or people's reception? Because the weirdest thing I found about it is that you know people feel Nolan movies but don't understand them on first viewing typically. They know what they're getting, and they know the story even if they can't. Like you had this great description of these movies are easier to watch than they are to explain. But because we've all been quarantined, the water cooler hasn't existed in 2020, and maybe online so much. So I'm wondering how much that hurt people's appreciation of Tenet.
Yeah, it had such an interesting kind of rollout, and the kind of critical take on it does seem to have been bifurcated completely between those saying this is the kind of the Nolan film to end all Nolan films, and then those who've come out kind of scratching their heads saying, it threw me. I just couldn't, I couldn't follow it. And so, it's curious. It's very hard to work out because its release in the US was so halting because of COVID. It's a very peculiar film to try and work out whether it was a big success or not. I think it is, they'll probably make the money back.
You got a grade on a curve here.
Yeah, but I think the kind of the question of whether it was a sort of big popular hit or not is one of those kind of great it's we're going to have to put that alongside the spinning totem in Inception and the memory lapse in Memento is just one of the big imponderables of Nolan's career. Like, we're going to be arguing for years as to whether this film was A, his kind of masterpiece, or B, his Waterloo. Like, people are so, and at the moment, in a very Nolan fashion, it just seems to be both,
Yeah, well, because you had there's one passage in the book you describe, like you talk about Ryan's Daughter or the theatrical version of The Abyss or 1941 as the movies that end these streaks. And there's a part of me that wonders, like, for those who think of it as his Waterloo, does he get a mulligan on this? Like, can he get the best of both worlds, where like he learns from there? Okay, one other thing I do want to talk to you about is the thing that I love about Nolan, just because I think it's bold and it's punk rock, but I also think, like, for a man who's so technically obsessed, is this odd, almost poke in the eye Achilles heel, to mix metaphors, of the clarity of his dialogue, of a guy who writes scripts that are very have a lot of exposition delivered by dialogue, but a filmmaker who's so musical and pushes audiences through the musicality of visuals and the actual music in a very sophisticated way. But at the same time, they're very logical movies that are hinge verbal back and forth. And every movie, specifically, I think I want to say Interstellar started this. You have that great passage about the viral moment from the book where I first read about it was the passage where he mentions that directors had called him about the audio in Interstellar, and he turned around and was like, "Well, but I think it's a bold mix." And I watched it yesterday, and to me, Interstellar is probably my favorite Nolan movie, but I have a pretty good sound system, and yeah, it is a bold mix, especially in the subwoofer, like he describes. But for a movie that hinges back and forth on you need to understand someone said something that's important, or even just the screenwriting trope of repeating words or quips at different times to mean different things, the leitmotif of that all, like you may not get that until like the third or fourth viewing, and that's not a denseness thing. That's just a clarity of a dialogue editor's work. Like,
it's interesting. Like there are you mentioned Interstellar, and I there's a passage in that where I think there's it's interesting the disadvantage, his love of music that builds, and he's not cut it. He's not scoring it to picture, so he's not going to be sort of tailoring the volume of it of Zimmer's kind of momentum that he's sort of built. He's not going to press pause on that or halt it to create a little pocket of space around some of the dialogue as a filmmaker might ordinarily do. They might literally just lower everything just to make sure that you hear. I can remember several instances in Interstellar that I like that, where he's sort of decided to go with what the music is telling him, right? As opposed to the dialogue. And I sort of, and then in Tenet, I mean, I think it's sort of, I mean, I didn't quite share other people's, I mean, I could hear fine, but then of course I'd read the script, which helped. So, that didn't, I'm not the best person to ask about it.
I was going to ask, when did you first see Tenet?
Like, so I think it was like July, like it was June or July of last year.
So before release, but not, but just shortly.
Release, exactly. But for the book, I just saw clips and I read the script, which kind of gave me like a head start, if you like. I mean, I will say that I think that the masks, it may be one of those things where when we listen to dialogue on the screen, we're not just listening, we're actually lip reading, we're watching faces as well.
Right.
And I wonder how much of it is a kind of panic. If you take away the visual of someone's lips moving, I wonder if there's a sort of internal sort of panic alarm starts to ring, like you've just been denied half of the means by which you normally read what someone is saying. And I wonder if that may be added as much to it as anything else. In other words, I could imagine a mix of that film that was exactly the same, but they weren't wearing masks, and people might come out of it and just kind of going, "Yeah, that's fine,"
Okay.
It's sort of it's as much the visual information we're getting that leads us to sort of. I can remember a couple of scenes in particular, really, where they're both that Branagh and he are kind of in these sort of the mask, and it does lead to a kind of, am I getting everything? There's a sort of
and he's put a lot of characters in masks before. I mean, I keep coming back to the Altman versus Warren Beatty argument over McCabe and Mrs. Miller, where Altman thought Beatty hated the movie because he wanted to remix the whole thing, and Beatty came back and said, "I just want you to remix the first reel to acclimate people." Because what I've had in the past is the one movie I worked on that had a studio buy it eventually. They came back later and they remixed the first reel. And the thought behind it was that if you can get clarity for the first reel, then people will acclimate to it. And what typically happens in an editing room is you get so used to it, you know what it is, and so you assume everyone will know what it is. But at the same time, proof of concept still applies, and Nolan seems very vigilant about audience narrative. He seems like to show these movies to people and make sure that they get the narratives. I was wondering, do you think the movie, how much was he able to show Tenet to people while in the pandemic? And if he was able to show it less than normal, do you think that might have hindered certain like post elements? I mean, like he was working with a new composer. He's working with a new editor. Um, just all these new things coming on top of the fact that like he's finishing post in a very unfortunate circumstance,
Yeah,
unique
I
one.
don't know. I mean, I have to say, I'm sort of, not, I don't have any kind of privileged information on that because I sort of said, I mean, the last time I sort of met him in person was literally in December of 2019, and he was then editing rather, Tenet, and nobody had even heard of COVID. There were a couple of cases in Wuhan at that point. Nobody was paying it the slightest bit of attention, and you know, and I kind of saw what I could see. I read the script. We had our interview. We shook hands, and I kind of like I bade him farewell, and that was my last interception of like the production process. So everything that happened after that, um, in terms of the way the movie was finished and the conditions in which it was finished, and so on, um, I read about like everybody else. And so I kind of left it sort of at the halfway mark. So I don't really know what the answer to that is, but I do also think there's another factor, which is he's sort of, you know, Tenet is quite a noisy movie. There's noisier than Inception is. There's sort of, I think, oh, maybe is that right? It feels to me like there's more gunfire and explosions, but maybe that's wrong. But
No, don't.
um, more heavy machinery. But then there's the train. I don't know. Well, anyway, there's a mixture of things. It's an action movie, but at the same time, it's this high concept action movie that requires exposition. And in Tenet, for some reason, they come in the same scene. So you'll have exposition at the same time as the action a lot of the time, which means that
Yeah.
they're sort of shouting it. In Inception, because of the heist movie setup, they had the luxury of those fantastic scenes in front of the blackboard where they say, here's how it's going to work out. And it's totally quiet. There's no competition. So we can all just sort of drink it all in.
You point out that that's what a heist movie does. Half the fun is the exposition scenes.
Yeah. Whereas with Tenet, he had a sort of different challenge, which is, it's more of an action. It feels to me more of a sort of an action movie. And there's sort of, so the exposition has to be literally just shouted over the top of the machinery, So that to me sometimes also kind of, I think, explains why people have difficulties.
I mean, the other thing I like with Tenet though, one of our past guests, guest host Kyle Smith, told me this thing that he had a challenge to see of major filmmakers how many of have you seen every single one of their movies twice at least. Not, and he didn't want to count like obscure shorts, and the only ones I had were Kubrick and Nolan was a close second, and Tenet's the only one I haven't seen the second time, and I wonder if I need multiple viewings. I braved like it was my first movie back and felt weird watching it. I wasn't in the happiest time to watch it just because I felt very exposed and the theaters have felt safer since then. So maybe
Mm.
I don't know. I mean, I want to give this guy the benefit of the doubt because it's been rewarded in the past multiple times.
Yeah, he. Well, we talked, a little bit about like what he calls, his attempts to make sure that it's palindromically correct. I think he uses that phrase in the book, which is to say, he felt when I sort of left him, I felt like he had 101 counter arguments for every objection he felt that was coming. You know, and I feel certain that like on some level he's kind of worked it all out in a way that would sort of defeat people coming at him with like, well, what about this or what about that? But
Filmmakers tend to do that. I love
yeah,
that exchange you had in the book with him about the plot holes you found in Interstellar, the things you didn't like about it, and he finally just says, "Well, maybe it didn't work for you."
yeah. I mean, I'll say my only contribution to this, I think, that's kind of relevant is I actually think that the confusions of the plot are actually rather come from the same source as Interstellar, which is his fondness for antagonists who are entirely off screen.
Hmm.
In Interstellar, it's the future, the five-dimensional beings who construct the Tesseract and place it there for Cooper to kind of find his way, which feels to me at least very much like the author interfering in his own movie a little bit. Like it just feels like the hand of God has come down and sort of placed this kind of wonderful thing that enables him to escape and save the day. And the Tenet has the same set of antagonists. They're sort of the bad guys here, but it's those people in the future that are essentially plotting the whole film. And I think that I think it gives him
Yeah.
enormous latitude in terms of it gives him great control of certain elements of the plot, but without the kind of accountability that comes with actual dramatic presences, characters who have to defend their patch. And like there's a kind of it's a level playing field when the people plotting the movie actually have to appear in the movie too.
Yeah.
And
Or Branna just having the nihilist world-ending Bond movie motivations.
yeah, whereas if they're off screen the entire time, they're not really dramatic presences, really, and they can be made to do whatever you really want them to do. And so I sort of sense that there's an authorial hand at work sometimes. And so if I had a single thing to say, I would just don't do off-screen antagonists anymore.
Well, okay, I want to bring one thing up because I mentioned Interstellar, I think, is my favorite, and I rewatched it yesterday. And in the book, you mentioned the feeling that the five-dimensional beings at the end are the gods in the machine. And, like, I had this confusion from my very first viewing that helped me out where he keeps saying, it's us doing this over and over.
Mhm.
I just assumed it was human beings from the future.
Well, I did too. I think I think I went with yes.
And it's helped by the fact that the movie ends with every other human, like everyone on the station is too complacent to live the life they have, and
Yeah.
he still has to go out and explore a little more. And
Yeah.
the nature of the ending.
I think there's a bit of blur. I think isn't it both? I mean, I'm sort of assuming it's the sort of our future selves are these five-dimensional
Yeah.
beings. I certainly wouldn't counter what that explanation that you've just given. Listen, I also love Interstellar. The thing I had to say, to him, I was trying to sort of I was saying that even though there were certain things where I sort of sensed his hand a little bit more in it than I do in other films, but I still love it's sort of the emotions of the film, and I still, love that sort of opening act, and I also love, obviously the Cooper's disintegration in front of the video screen, which is just stunning.
Yeah, God, that was a kid. And McConaughey's performance in general, just because like
Yeah.
he was, I don't know if it completely goes against the. There was something about like a less like a lower class feeling. There was less the suit and tie, smooth operator feeling, and just more raw emotional. That just really blended well together
Yeah.
in the movie.
I mean, to me, it resonates like it just in that film. That sense of grief and loss and sort of loneliness, and it's a new. When I first watched that, it's like I just experienced a new emotion. Like it was a strange sort of compound of other emotions that I kind of would name: abandonment, loneliness, loss, grief, and then also a certain amount of terror. At the vastness of time, and all those things are all mixed in this sort of new compound, and it's haunting, really. I really remember coming out of it and thinking that I have never experienced that before, and yet I kind of know what it is. It's very strange.
Mhm.
Like I'm connecting with that man, and I sort of know what he's feeling. I think I can guess what he's feeling, and none of us have ever been in that situation. And it's sort of I must admit that's really him at his best, because that's like Memento. Like I've never been an amnesiac, and my wife hasn't been killed, and like what amazes me is like so many people like just jump into that guy's shoes. We just know instantly like everything he's thinking and feeling, even though his experience couldn't be more off the beaten track. Like it couldn't be more unusual, and yet
Yeah.
we all of us kind of like connect with something in there. And it's so interesting to me, like the idea that his sort of life is sort of running backwards. I mean, I think for me at least, the feeling is, I think I've definitely felt out of my depth in something. We've all felt unbalanced. We've all felt disoriented, and in a sort of a hostile situation. And that's a feeling that I think he bottles. He just totally nails that in Memento. Um, and at least that's kind of what I think people are connecting to. But also just how smart he is too. He's just sort of trying to solve his problem, and he's such a polite fellow, Leonard. Your heart just goes out to him. Like he doesn't have a moment to really complain about his situation too much. He's just rushed off his feet. Um, so yeah, when I think about the one thing that I don't buy is this idea that Nolan isn't emotional.
No, I'm totally with you on that.
Yeah,
Totally.
like the emotion is definitely there.
Especially again, I come back to Kubrick. If you want to take two big perfectionist, technically adept filmmakers that are called cold,
mm,
one of these directors is not like the other.
yeah,
Like Nolan's. Well, I mean, like in Interstellar, you compare. Well, time seems to be the thing. Like just that time being out of control. Like you mentioned there's the one scene in Boyhood that you compared to some of the stuff in Interstellar, and like I find that one to be the most personal, just because it seems like he's having a conversation with his kids
mm,
that are his age, and that he knows that they're growing old, and as a parent, his life is theirs. I find it very touching. You brought this up. I don't. You mentioned it briefly in the Prestige chapter, but was there any conversation about the dead girlfriend, dead wives, dead fiance, dead women trope?
no, I didn't actually. No, we didn't talk about that. It was curious. I was definitely aware of it, um, and I sort of found that there was a little bit of me that rebelled against wanting to go to him with the sort of top 10 issues that people have
With
with
what
him. You
Twitter
know what I
wants to
mean?
know about it?
Yeah, I had I made a pact. I made a decision with myself. I wasn't going to ask him about what happens at the end of Inception, and I wasn't going to ask him about the Dead Wife, and I wasn't going to do the kind of top five, things of his. Um, and I don't know quite why that was. I think it's because I found pretty quickly that as an interview subject, he's the most well defended around those issues.
Okay.
So if he's heard it 20 times, yeah, he's got an answer for you. You know what I mean? And so a bit of me was just like, I'm just not interested in hearing his 21st rebuttal at this point. I'd much rather ask him something that he hasn't been asked before, or at least try.
Use your time properly.
Yeah, so that's sort of maybe what it was. But you know, I mean, but it's sort of true. I mean, but I don't. I mean, I think at the same time, there's stuff in the Prestige which suggests to me, I can tell that the man who made that is married, and has had to juggle work and family life. Like the
Mm.
main theme of the film when it comes to the Sarah subplot and, Rebecca Hall, and is how much these men divide their lives between their work and their personal life, their family life. Like he's dramatizing something that's personal to him. He has had that. That's that to me, and you can tell. I think in the weird, particularly in the Rebecca Hall performance, that I mean, I love that. I actually love her performance in that film so much
Yeah,
because you
totally.
really feel like this is just a breath of fresh air. Like this girl is just this breath of fresh air, and she brings this sort of dose of emotional honesty to Christian Bale, and he's never even considered it as an idea, and I love that. I mean, I sort of do think of the Prestige as being a kind of an advance, certainly in terms of his female characters, and um, she's fully rounded, and she has loves, and she's funny, and
Well, at the prodding of the book, that was one of the ones I had seen it when it came out a few times, but I probably haven't seen it since theatrical, so I watched that this week.
yeah.
And what you talked about with the work family relationship really like bug me about it, which seems like Nolan's completely different in a personal space right now. So much of that movie is about the obsessive need in the work that ends up destroying the families around them. And I just don't see. It's like Spielberg can't make Close Encounters right now. He's changed as a family man. I don't want to take too much more of your time. I want to wind down. One question I was going to ask. You had a cameo with Glenn Kinney, who had also been on the show,
Oh
and
yeah.
he had the because what was funny about the scene is like you talk about you brought a bunch of people to measure time with Tootsie,
Oh,
and at the end of it you mentioned Empire Strikes Back, and Empire Strikes Back is one of my it occasionally is my favorite movie. I mentioned it's my favorite movie of all time.
hmm.
That timeline has haunted me forever on that movie.
It's he got me thinking like uh, this idea that like you can't really nail down how much time has elapsed in the characters' lives in the course of a film. And at first I was a little suspicious of it, and I thought, well, that's got to be that can't be true. I mean, obviously there are films where you can tell with a stopwatch. um, but yeah, Empire Strikes Back turned out to be one of those films where I kind of looked at it and with his you know skeptical eye about timelines, and I suddenly realized that I just had no idea like how much what I saw, what I think what I saw in Tootsie, I think is going on in Empire Strikes Back, which is there are multiple timelines operating in any given movie, and in fact they're wildly disparate and cover different periods, but they're never put together in a way that explicitly puts them in opposition to one another. So if the audience, it never becomes an issue for the audience, But there are bits of that movie that seem to take months, others that take years. Like it's very the training to be a Jedi really ought to be over a period of,
Yeah.
what I mean.
The closest I at one point I came to the conclusion that when they escape the asteroid belt and go to Bespin,
Mm,
that trip had to have taken 6 months off
that's
screen.
exactly
That
right.
that was the closest I came. But
And,
with Tootsie, it's just like it makes emotional sense, but that movie makes sense at all with how it was made and how overwritten it was by so many different people. Like
yeah,
that seems to be the reason, and it's a
the,
miracle that movie came together.
the real the Jenga piece that brings the whole thing down for me, once you start thinking about it, which is not to say I don't enjoy the movie and it totally works, but the Jenga piece that's most troublesome for me in Tootsie is Terry Garr, who is strung along by Dustin Hoffman's character for a long time. She thinks that she's dating him, um,
Yeah,
and uh, and that misperception can only take a matter of weeks, really. How long can you seriously go under the illusion that you're dating someone without actually having seen them or kind of regularly sleeping
well,
with them?
and as you point out in the book, like how long does it take to become a star in 1980
Yeah,
on the soap opera?
that's right. And so it takes, we sort of figured out that maybe he's on, that could be 9 months or so. And maybe the romance with Jessica Lange, but ideally, if you were doing that as a rom com, you'd probably shorten that. It wouldn't be 9 months, but certainly like at least 9 months for him to become famous and to get on the cover of magazines and to have his contract come up so that it needs to be renewed. In which case, Terry Garr just looks like the big idiot, like, oh, what on earth
Yeah,
thinking? Like, she thinks he's dating her for 9 months, but it doesn't really work. It doesn't even bother you because when Terry Garr comes back into the picture, it just sort of what happens is it just sort of speeds things up. It's just like you're back on Terry Garr time and you're back on sort of this farce framework. And
yeah, that's a good way of
it's
putting
just
it.
like a car changing gear. That's how you interpret it. You don't really sort of think, oh, I'm going to try and mathematically make this fit. You just kind of go, oh, things have sped up.
Well, so it just I mean, the one thing Nolan seems to nail is that whenever you want to, even though seems to be a logical guy, whenever you want to add logic to a movie, if it feels right, if you can't argue with that, if it feels right. But the if is a big part, and it takes a long effort and a lot of trial and error to get a movie to feel right too.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, he's the first, our first encounter with him feels, like we came out feeling like kind of chess players a little bit. Like, his films reward. I mean, Memento is so unusually intelligent. That's almost the headline when you come out of that film is, my God, that film feels smart.
When did you see Following?
Oh, God,
Because I was pretty late to the game. I mean, I think a lot of people would have had to have been.
yeah, I certainly saw it after Memento. I didn't see it before Memento.
I probably saw it after Batman Begins or something like that.
Yeah. Um, and it's sort of it's I think because that was the headline for so long, it took a while to realize that there were other things going on under the bonnet. No, you don't say that here, do you? You say the hood of the car. There are other things going on there. With regard to the kind of the emotional sort of weight of the films, but retrospectively, it gets a little easier to spot. Because like if you're not connected to them emotionally, you're just not engaged. I mean, a movie that genuinely is cold, that genuinely has no emotion, that the viewer has no emotional connection with, is actually a movie they're bored by. Like
Sure,
that,
it's an unengaging movie.
that's
Movies
right.
aren't about engagement.
If you're hoping that that guy doesn't fall off the plank, you're emotionally engaged. If you hope that guy gets the girl, you're emotionally engaged. Like it's really just a question of what you mean by emotion, really. I mean, I guess maybe some people think, well, would have to be a Nora Ephron movie, or it would have to be like for it to qualify as emotional. But
Yeah.
Dunkirk, I agree with him. Like, there's plenty of emotion in that in the film.
I know I have some friends. Whenever they send me cuts of stuff to watch, they always ask me about pace, and every time without fail, I'm like, I don't give a shit about pace. All I care about is do I know what's going on?
Right.
Like, did you get your details clear?
Yeah.
And, which is why I was so harping on the dialogue. But have you ever made the comparison? I mean, you have this really brilliant point in the book where everyone compares Nolan to Hitchcock, but you think he's more like Fritz Lang, which I thought, in terms of like, you know, high designed but can make spy movies at the same time, I thought was a really adept. But I did want to talk about his wife, Thomas.
Hmm.
Do you see a Alma Hitchcock relationship there? I mean, she's not in post or anything, but he mentions that she's really essential in casting and story too.
Okay.
And my friends that are like have husband and wives that filmmaking teams where they are formidable. Like they yeah.
I think that she's definitely like the unsung kind of hero of that squadron of people. The crew that he's gathered around him, all of whom have had the spotlight shone on them at some point, but she hasn't. And I actually think that's one of the things I wanted to rectify a little bit, is just sort of to make sure that she was in it, because enough, because he does talk about her influence a lot. She does talk about her as being an important voice on his screenplays. The first reader of his screenplays gives him input on them. Um, Casting decisions, and yeah, I mean, she's a sort of she's the does the sort of producer role. And he said that he tried to I think which one? I think it was Batman Begins, where he stepped out of doing producing just in order to direct, and then found that didn't really work. That he needed to be working with her. I think what the thing that they have, the thing I was talking about, the discipline, like this kind of
Mm-hmm.
this almost inhuman discipline, this ability to bring in the films ahead of budget or under, ahead of schedule and under budget, and to respect the time. I think by being married to your producer, you are almost baking that into the cake, because that's the producer's job, is to sort of crack the whip and say, no, you can't have that second aircraft. You're going to have to do with one. And by being married to your producer, you're essentially meaning that from the very get-go, you're thinking economically. You're thinking about how to do this with the least, so to my mind, that could possibly be the answer to that whole minimalist maximalist issue we were talking about earlier. Like, like maybe that's the reason. Maybe that's the thing that's allowed him to do that.
The two brains with a shared
Yeah,
goal.
that's right. So I hear you, and I sort of think that like her contribution is kind of is one I was very pleased to sort of just thread throughout the book. It is highly unusual, and she's sort of been with him, from the very beginning, every single movie.
Okay. I guess I got one more question, although I'm pretty positive I know the answer to this. You read a bunch of the early drafts of the scripts before Nolan made his pass on this. You didn't by chance get a glimmer at his Howard Hughes draft, have you?
No, I asked him, and he, for a moment, it looked like he might, uh,
Ah,
but you know, there was a bit of him that I think the same bit of him that likes to keep things secret, and also the bit of him that thinks, well, I might want to use that one day. Although I must say, I think he's used enough of it to have dispelled that as a reason. Like he's used bits of it in the third Batman film, and he's used bits of it in Inception. I think it would be very difficult for him now to make it for that reason, because he kind of has exposed some of the elements in that script to the light of day. So we have sort of seen some of it to some degree.
it seems like forever he was saying that was his best script, though.
Yeah, that's the one I would. If I had an unread script, I'd call that my best one too.
Well reasoned. That yes, the next movie
I'm
is
sure.
always going to be the best
I'm sure
movie.
he's. I mean, he could well be right. I mean, it's very. It's got a lot of there are a lot of kind of great sort of themes for him there, and I love this idea that he wasn't going to be treating him as a fruitcake, that he was just going to be treating him really as just like an entirely rational, sane actor. Like, I mean, that in and of itself is kind of like that's an intriguing premise for a movie. Like to take Howard Hughes as if he was sort of sane, like that's kind of wild. I mean, I can see perhaps why maybe the producers were a little bit scared of it. They wrote it for were a little scared of that idea.
Well, if you take everything 1970s before, it makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah,
Yeah. Speaking of future works, are you sticking with reviewing for now? Or are you starting to think about the next book?
yeah.
Because I mean, like, is there another director on the horizon that you're?
Yeah, I mean, I do have an idea for a book, and I haven't got to the point where I'm sort of, talking about it, but I do have one that's sort of really about movies and books. But in terms of other directors, I'd also love to do, I'd love to do a woman actually. I love, Greta Gerwig. I think she's fantastic. I mean,
Mm.
it would be nice to kind of do that. So I'm really just taking her on to just make more movies, so I can kind of because that was the thing with Nolan, was like, oh, I haven't made enough movies yet. I haven't made enough, so I had to wait until he made enough movies. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think she's got everything. So yeah, we'll see. I mean, but on the other one, yeah, I'm gonna say tight-lipped on the other one. I've caught some of his secret, his kind of
The
his,
secrecy.
his secrecy. I'm like, oh, I got to observe it. He was so tight-lipped about Tenet too. I was very all the time that I was interviewing him. There was originally the plan was not to include Tenet, because I thought the book was going to come out before the film, and so the idea was I would know nothing about the new movie, and we didn't talk about it at all, and he didn't say anything about it, and the only clue I ever got was I think at the very beginning of the process, I said to him, I just apropos of nothing very much, I just said, I think you should make a spy movie one day, and he kind of went, yeah, I think I will, and then yeah, but don't put that in the book, he said. And I was like, that's weird. Why did he tell me not to put that in the book? And then I was like, oh, because the new movie's got to be a spy movie. And that was the only time I saw his cards, if you know what I mean. And I still
Yeah.
wasn't exactly sure. But there was a sort of, but when I sort of read the script finally, I tripped up on the schedule and I realized this book was not going to come out before the film. So we had to include Tenet. So then I kind of went and read it. And I had this very eerie sensation of like reading a, the, the thing that our conversations had all been edged around. Like there was this sort of Tenet shaped object around which we moved and about which we said nothing. But
You
who's,
have the great comparison of this is his North by Northwest if Inception's is Vertigo.
yeah. exactly, and
It has everything. It's the apotheosis of all his filmmaking.
exactly, and all its themes had bled into our conversations, but just without him talking about Tenet explicitly. So when I finally did read the script, I was like, "Oh, so that's why we were talking about nuclear weapons, and that's why we were talking about that film that ran backwards, and it all suddenly made sense." But we'd literally described this kind of this black hole object, and I knew the shape of it, but I didn't know what it was in it. So anyway. But that's just a way of saying that he managed to kind of go for like a good year without giving me a single clue as to what he was doing. So I definitely saw up close that kind of discipline. But yeah, I caught the secrecy bug.
I was gonna say your next book is going to be codenamed after your daughter's diary or something.
Exactly.
Tom Shone, I wanted to thank you for being on the podcast and thank you for writing this book.
Oh, thank you, Shane. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. And yeah, I think I'm ready now to go back and just see Tenet one more time.